Hi, this is Joe from PrepAgent. Today, we're talking about easements. An easement is a right held by one person to use the land of another person for a specified purpose, such as access to a property. When talking about easements, you'll hear the term ingress, which means to enter, and egress, which means to exit. An appurtenant easement. An appurtenant easement involves two properties owned by two different owners. The two properties involved are called the dominant and servient tenement. When you're not sure about who is who, just think about what the two words mean. Dominant, they are dominating, therefore they are in charge. Servient, they are serving, so the servient tenement is serving the dominant tenement's purpose. In more tangible terms, the dominant tenement is walking over the servient tenement's property. In real-world situations, the dominant tenement property is typically smaller than the servient tenement property. For example, let's say your property is landlocked. That means it has no direct access to a public road, so to access your property, you must cross someone else's property. That property is now serving a purpose to your property, so it has become the servient tenement to your dominant tenement property. The easement continues after you and your neighbors sell your respective properties to other people. An appurtenant easement attaches itself to a piece of property, so it is said to run with the land. This means that whenever a property is sold, the new owner has the same right to use the easement as the previous owner did. Under each state's statute of frauds law, easements must be in writing to be valid. Easement and grows. Another type of easement is called the easement and grows. An easement and grows has no dominant tenement because the people crossing the land are not using it to get to another property. That's why utility companies are common examples of an easement and grows. For example, the electric company may want to connect the power lines between two poles. If they need to cross your property to do this, they would be granted an easement in grows. Easement by necessity. An easement by necessity is created by a court. Easements by necessity are issued when someone must cross over someone else's land to gain access to their property. For example, let's say property owner Ann sells a back portion of her land to buyer Dave, but neglects to give Dave an easement for access. If Ann refuses to give Dave the easement, Dave can go to a court and have an easement by necessity granted. Easements by necessity are also considered appurtenant easements that will now run with the land. Easement by prescription. An easement by prescription is a type of easement created by the actions of one person against the interests of another person. Here's an example to explain how easement by prescriptions work. Every night when your neighbor Joe comes home, he drives his car across a corner of your property. You see him, but never stop him. And he does it for a long time. Eventually you get tired of him driving across your property and tell him to stop. But he says, "No way, I have an easement by prescription." Joe takes the matter to court and the court agrees with him. The fact that Joe's actions persisted over a long period of time are a big factor in the court granting him the easement. And now, Joe now has a permanent easement by prescription across your property. Easements by prescription are the result of a lawsuit, so a court order is required for them to be granted. The length of time a property must be crossed to create an easement by prescription varies according to what state you're in. You saw Joe cross your property, his use was open and notorious, which in legal terms meaning not hidden, is also hostile, which just means it was not in your best interest. By not telling Joe to stop sooner, you gave him implied permission to use your property, so the court granted Joe the easement. Terminating easements. Now let's talk about how to end easements. Easements can be terminated in several ways. You could terminate an easement with an agreement or release. The person who possesses the easement, also known as the dominant tenement, agrees to give up the easement or release it to the person whose property is being crossed, also known as the servient tenement. You can also end an easement by merging. For example, let's say Ashley has an easement across Brittany's property. Brittany then buys Ashley's property. The easement disappears since obviously Brittany would not need an easement to cross her own property. Next, there is abandonment, which simply means you stop using it. For one reason or another, you stop crossing the property. Unlike a dog, when you abandon it, an easement will cease to exist. On a side note, please rescue a dog. Last but not least, the need no longer exists. We discussed before how you could create an easement by necessity. Well, what if that need no longer exists? If you could prove that, then the easement will no longer exist either. This is Joe from PrepAgent, reminding you to keep it concise and keep it simple. And for more great information to help you pass your real estate exam, go to PrepAgent.com.